Welcome to your Chapter 10 video lecture series where we're going to talk about Section 10.4 on skeletal muscle metabolism. Our muscle cells have just a little bit of ATP storage. Stored ATP is going to be spent after about 5 seconds of intense exertion, and additional ATP rapidly is going to be produced by an enzyme known as myokinase. Phosphate will be transferred from one ADP to another in order to make ATP. And so we're going to talk about 3 ways in which we can generate ATP in our skeletal muscle fiber. It'll be through creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and aerobic cellular respiration. So first is creatine phosphate. It's going to contain a high energy bond between the creatine and the phosphate. So we can imagine this right over here. And our phosphate can be transferred to the ADP molecule in order to form ATP. Notice how this reaction is taking place in the presence of creatine kinase, and we are left with the product of creatine. This will supply us with about 10 to 15 seconds of additional energy. And then what we talked about earlier was ADP along with another ADP. So we're transferring a phosphate from this ADP molecule to the other one using the enzyme myosin kinase. And as a result, we get one ATP molecule and one AMP, meaning monophosphate. We only have one phosphate left here, whereas this molecule has 3 phosphates. And then when our muscle goes back to resting, we can use ATP to break off a phosphate, add it to our creatine using creatine kinase, and we will restore our creatine phosphate for the next time we need to use it. In this process, we are not requiring oxygen, although our ATP that we create is limited. Now let's talk about glycolysis. This is a process that also is not requiring oxygen, and instead we are going to use glucose. And this could be glucose from our blood, or it could be a breakdown of our muscles' glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a large molecule of repeating glucose molecules bonded to each other. And we go through a process in which we are going to end up with 2 pyruvate molecules and 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule that goes through glycolysis. And this is all taking place in the cytosol. And lastly, we have aerobic cellular respiration. Now this process does require oxygen, and we could see that coming from either our bloodstream or myoglobin, or we can even use fatty acids and amino acids if we need to. So this aerobic cellular respiration is now going to take place in our mitochondria. And we ended up with pyruvate from going through that glycolysis process, right? And so we can use pyruvate to oxidize it to carbon dioxide. We're going to transfer the chemical bond energy to ANDH and FADH2. And the energy will be used to generate ATP by oxidative phosphorylation. And that, as a result, will produce 30 ATP. Now, I mentioned we could also use fatty acids and amino acids. Our triglycerides can be used as fuel to provide ATP. And so when we find triglycerides within our blood, we are going to break it down into free fatty acids and glycerol. And the longer those fatty acid chains are, the more ATP we can gain from it. And here is the full picture altogether of these 3 metabolic processes that we can use to generate ATP for our muscles. Now we need to talk about lactate formation and its fate. Lactate formation is going to be from pyruvate, which you can see through glycolysis here. We have those 2 pyruvate molecules, and it's going to occur under conditions of low oxygen availability. Our pyruvate then is going to convert to lactate using the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. Lactate can then be used as fuel by our skeletal muscle fiber to enter into our blood and taken up by our cardiac muscle or our liver. Now there is this lactic acid cycle, also known as Cori cycle, in which we are going to be cycling lactate to our liver, where it's going to be converted to glucose and transport of glucose back to the muscle for use to create ATP. And our skeletal muscle metabolism will be chosen based on the intensity of an exercise. So for someone who is performing a sprint that's going to be less than 10 seconds, ATP is supplied primarily by a phosphate transfer system, meaning we're using that myosin kinase or creatine kinase. For a 400-meter sprint, which you can see over here, this is going to be about a minute or under a minute. ATP will be supplied primarily through glycolysis after the first few seconds. And then for longer distances, like a 1,500-meter run, which is going to be more than a minute, ATP will be supplied primarily through aerobic processes after that first minute. Now, as a result of exercising, you might accumulate some oxygen debt. This is going to be the amount of additional oxygen that's going to be needed after exercise to start to restore your pre-exercise conditions. So once you stop exercising and you're still kind of huffing and puffing, your body is trying to restore that oxygen, to breathe in that additional oxygen. And we need that oxygen to replace oxygen on our hemoglobin molecules within our red blood cells and our myoglobin molecules within our muscles. We also want to replenish our glycogen and replenish ATP and our creatine phosphate and convert any lactic acid back to glucose.